Welcome back to the Why I'm Right podcast. I'm your host, Matt Taylor, and today we're talking about an issue important to every single American out there, every single citizen out there, every single one of us who will be going to vote in this upcoming election. And we're talking about election integrity and the importance of voter IDs in this country. And it's something that if you don't remember, I like to say hindsight's 2020. Now that saying was around for a long time. But right now, when we're talking about election integrity, and I say hindsight is 2020, we have to look back at 2020 and say, okay, we may have not have gotten it right in 2020, but we have a chance now in 2024 to make up for some of those mistakes and try to make some change in this country. And so one of the biggest issues, if you remember, from the 2020 election was mass mail-in ballots. Now, they used COVID-19, and again, you've heard my opinion on COVID-19 in past podcasts. You'll hear about it again today, I'm sure, and throughout future podcasts as well. But if you remember in 2020, what happened is COVID came into this country, impacted the election clearly, impacted the economy clearly. But when it talks about election integrity and how it impacted the election, it caused mass mail-in ballots across this country. For the first time in our country's history, we sent out mass mail-in ballots. Now, mail-in ballots have been around for a long time, and that's fine. Mail-in ballots were created for the purpose of when we had military men and women serving overseas, or we have people in this country who were hospitalized for long periods of time, we still want them to be able to have the ability to vote in our elections. So in principle, on paper, the idea of mail-in ballots is a good thing. And so the question becomes, where do we stop? Now, if you're on vacation, you leave the country, you're not going to be home to vote, should be able to request a ballot? Personally, I'd say yes. But the issue becomes when we send out mass mail-in ballots and we make it a way to vote, and we know that there is a clear ability for those votes to not be authentic votes. And when I say that, when you send out mass ballots to people across the country who didn't request mass ballots, first and foremost, for example, their ballot can be sent to them. They could fill in the ballot, send it in, and then show up again on election day. That was shown to have happened in 2020. That's one of the issues. Another thing is the rolls. The voter rolls are not up to date. And the reason I know this personally, again, I try to use my personal experience as much as possible on this podcast, but I'm still on voter rolls in North Carolina when I went to college. And the reason I know that is because I'm getting emails and text messages asking me if I'm going to vote in North Carolina in this upcoming election. Well, since I lived in North Carolina, I also lived in New Jersey. I get the same thing every time there's a representative, a congressional vote. I get text message and email all the time asking if I'm going to vote in New Jersey. And I lived in Massachusetts since college. And I get text messages, emails, the same thing. And so, again, would I be able to walk in and vote in those states? I don't know. But I at least asked the question, if I'm still getting text messages and emails asking me if I'm voting on election day in multiple states, and I now live in Florida, years later, it seems to be a problem. And so, again, the biggest issue in this country, I believe, when we're talking about election integrity, comes down to the idea of voter ID. And if you ask the Democrat Party right now, many people, maybe not all of them, because some people in the Democrat Party are seeing this for what it is. Many Democrats say that voter IDs are racists. Many Democrats say there's no evidence of voter fraud. Therefore, we don't need voter ID. And my answer to that question is simple, or that argument is simple. Just because you haven't gotten robbed, does that mean you don't lock your doors at night? And that's making a big stretch saying, I don't think there's voter fraud. I do believe there's voter fraud, and I do believe mail-in ballots played a role in 2020. And I do believe the lack of voter IDs in this country has played a role in the voter fraud that gone on, not just in 2020, in 2022, and I'm sure here again in 2024. And so when we're talking about voter ID in this country, I believe it's important to look at the issue and to hear what politicians on both sides of the aisle are arguing for. Is it racist to force somebody to have an ID in this country? I don't believe so. But I'm going to play you a clip here from Joe Biden in 2014. And this is a Joe Biden, again, that sounds somewhat articulate. He uses some big words. So you can kind of think for yourself with this. Has Joe Biden declined? Maybe hearing this clip will jog your memory. But here's a clip from Joe Biden in 2014, and he says that voter ID is an attempt to repress minority voting. And he says it's masqueraded as an attempt to prevent corruption. So here's Joe Biden in 2014 talking about how voter ID is racist and an attempt to repress minority voting. Here's Joe.
Name it for what it is. It's an attempt to repress minority voting, masquerading as an attempt to end corruption.
Now that's Joe Biden. Again, he uses the word like masquerading. I don't know if you could even say that word today. But the idea behind voter ID being racist in this country is foolish. And it's not just Joe Biden that believes this. There's Congress people across the country. Nancy Pelosi has said it. People at the top of the game, Hillary Clinton has said it, that voter ID is some form of racism and a throwback to Jim Crow. And so here's a clip of Chris Cuomo, who I actually respect. I listen to a lot. But here's Chris Cuomo explaining the argument a little bit in detail, and then I'm going to dive into it and kind of give the other side of this. But here's Chris Cuomo on the PBD podcast, the podcast I actually listen to often, talking about how voter ID could be racist. Here's Chris.
The argument is that culturally, socioeconomically, as you go down in terms of the poverty level, as poverty becomes more important, there's less connection with government. There's less percentage of people who want to interface with government and who have identification. So the argument is, if you say you need an ID to vote, you will have an unfair bias against those strata of society that don't tend to get IDs and don't want to deal with government.
Now, did you hear that there at the end? He sums up the argument pretty intelligently and says that voter ID tends to impact those people who socioeconomically don't want to interfere with government, don't want to interact with government. And I disagree with that completely. Because IDs are something in this country, and I'm going to run through it here, but IDs are something in this country that you need for every aspect of life. So before I dive in deeper, I wanted to touch on a few things in this country you need an ID for, a government-issued ID for, in order to do these things in this country. You need an ID to drink alcohol. You need an ID to buy cigarettes. You need an ID to open a bank account. You need an ID to apply for food stamps, to apply for welfare, to apply for Medicaid or Social Security, to apply for unemployment or a job, to rent or buy a house, to apply for a mortgage, to rent, buy, or lease a car, or drive a car, to get on an airplane, to get married, to purchase a gun, to adopt a pet, to rent a hotel room. And this is the big one here, to buy a cell phone. And I'm going to pause here for a second. It's important to note that 83% of blacks in this country have a cell phone. 85% of Hispanics have a cell phone. You need a government-issued ID to buy a cell phone. You need an ID to visit a casino, to pick up prescription medication, to donate blood, to purchase nail polish at CVS, to purchase spray paint at Home Depot, or to purchase over-the-counter cold meds. Now again, between you and I, is it realistic to say that black people, that minority people, that Hispanics aren't doing any of those things? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense. And so I wanted to touch on it here, but the reason this is a problem in our country, you need an ID to do all of those things, but the most sacred of things in our democratic republic is to elect representatives that represent you, to vote for representatives to speak on your voice, to speak on behalf of you, to vote on behalf of you. Again, I said it earlier. We are not a democracy in this country. People say we're a democracy. We're not. We're a democratic republic. If we were a democracy, you and I would have to vote on every single issue in this country. We don't. Instead, we vote for and elect representatives to vote for our beliefs, our opinions, to represent our views. And so the reason voter ID is such a big issue right now is because 16 of 50 states do not require any voter ID whatsoever. Hear me out. 16 of 50 states in this country do not require any ID whatsoever. I'm going to pause here for a second. Those 16 states I just mentioned equate to 212 of the 538 electoral college votes. One more time, 16 states don't require any ID whatsoever, and they equate to 212 of the electoral college votes in this country. 11 states of 50 don't require voter ID. They equate to 69 electoral college votes. So you have to show some sort of ID. It could be a credit card or something that has a name on it, but you don't need to show a photo ID. And so out of this country, 16 of 50 states don't require any ID whatsoever. 11 states that don't require a photo ID, but you have to show some form of ID, equates to 69 electoral college votes. That equates to 281 electoral college votes. You only need 276 to win the election. And so if you combine these two groupings together of states that don't either require voter ID or a photo ID, you're talking about 280 electoral college votes. This could be a rigged election right there. And so this issue, when you really look at it and dive in deeper, highlights a bigger issue in this country, which is they say things that they know aren't true. They know that voter ID is not racist. They know requiring someone to show a photo ID is not racist. Because if they didn't know that, and they actually believed what they're saying to you, then they would make the argument that it's racist to have someone show their ID when they're buying alcohol. It's racist when someone's getting on a plane to make them show an ID. It's racist for them when they're getting a job, applying for a phone. I mean, so many things in this country require a photo ID issued by the government. But for some reason, unbeknownst to you or I, it's racist to have someone show an ID to vote in this country. It makes zero sense. And when things don't make sense, again, the whole point of this podcast is to ask the whys. And for me, the why is simple here. The why is simple. They are using and manipulating the states that don't require voter ID in order to manipulate the results of presidential and congressional elections. If they weren't, this wouldn't be an issue. And so here's Republican Representative from the 38th District of Texas, Wesley Hunt, talking about in Congress about how he has a voter ID, he's black in this country, and the importance of requiring a voter ID for an election. Here's Wesley Hunt.
Of low expectations. Because it's the Democrat Party, not the Republican Party, that thinks so little of black America as a people of color that they make the case that being black in America means we can't obtain a government ID to vote. And that's not only a ridiculous assertion, it's demeaning and it's insulting. When it comes down to it, many of my colleagues on the left like to pretend that we're still living in the 1950s. Well, we're not. I've got some good news for you. It's 2024, and I know what year it is because I've been black for just over 40 years. And I'm also the son of a retired lieutenant colonel who grew up in the segregated South. You see, my parents grew up in a Jim Crow South in the 50s and 60s in New Orleans, Louisiana. Their next generation, my parents had 3 kids. My sister, brother, and I all went to West Point, all 3 of us. We all served our country in combat. And I sit before you today as a sitting United States congressman in a district in a suburb of Houston, Texas, that's a white majority district, that President Trump would have won by 25 points, and I won by almost 30 points. And that doesn't happen unless we've made some incredible progress in this great nation. Now, my colleagues on the left like to say that common sense voting laws, including requiring a government-issued ID, are racist, discriminatory, and burdensome. Do you know what my father had back in the 40s and 50s before it was even cool? A government-issued ID. And continuing in his footsteps, I too have multiple government-issued IDs, and while that might be shocking to many people in this country, people may ask, how's that happen? It's very simple. It's personal responsibility for all Americans in this country, regardless of what you look like. Sitting with me today is my global entry card, my military ID card, my Texas driver's license, my Texas license to carry, because that's how we roll in Texas, my congressional card, and of course, the good old-fashioned American passport. What sorcery is this? What am I, the Black Houdini? How was I able to pull off the impossible and attain not 1, not 2, not 3, but 6 government-issue IDs? Personal responsibility in this country.
And so you hear him talk about it there. He has 6 government-issued IDs, and you could say he's an outlier because he's a representative in our government. Fine. I'll even play devil's advocate here. But I just had a daughter 5 months ago, and it wasn't 24 hours after she was born in this country that she was given a social security number, and we had to get her social security number. And so that would count as a government-issued ID. It has her name on it. It has identification number on it. And so even someone that was born 24 hours ago in this country gets a government-issued ID. But in 11 of the 50 states, you don't even need to show that. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And so you listen to Wesley Hunt talk about it, and you have to start really trying to dissect the why. Why do Democrats say voter ID is racist? Because like I said earlier, in order to get a cell phone in this country, in order to buy a cell phone in this country, you have to show photo ID. 83% of blacks have cell phones in this country. 85% of Hispanics have a cell phone in this country. 85% of whites have a cell phone in this country. So is that racist for the Verizon Wireless, the AT&T, the Sprint, the T-Mobile? Is it racist? Or do they want to know and secure the fact that the person that is in front of them is the person who they say they are? If you're trying to protect the nation and you're trying to protect the integrity of anything, again, I go back to the list. Is it racist to ask somebody when they come to buy alcohol at your alcohol store, let me see your ID? I get it all the time. Is it racist for them to ask me that question? No, it's not, because they're trying to secure their license and the integrity of selling alcohol and following the laws of the land. And so I went through the whole list. This is every aspect of life. You need to show an ID in order to be able to do X, Y, or Z. And so I ask you, if it's not about racism, what is it about? And I can't come to a conclusion on my own. I've researched this in detail. And my thoughts on it, it's clear and simple. The only real reason to not have someone show their ID or require somebody to show their ID at the voting booth is if the person that's standing in front of you at the voting booth, the person you're sending a mail-in ballot to, is not the person they say they are. It's plain and simple. And we have a history in this country. If someone disagrees with you, the easy out is to call them a racist. The easy out is to attack their character. Because you can't beat them on the issue, you could beat them on the assassination of character. And so I believe this issue, there's no other justification for it. You know, we have Elon Musk sending rockets to the moon, and we can't figure out elections in this country. I mean, come on. And now we have advances in AI. We have advances in technology where your phone, in front of your face, your phone can actually detect if you're the person you say you are. Meaning there's facial recognition on your cell phone in this country where you can show your face and say, okay, this is me. If it's racist to have someone show their ID, is it racist to have them use their cell phone and check their face? Maybe that's how we should secure our elections. But the way we're running elections in this country is anything but full of integrity. And I go back to it. In 2020, the mass mail-in ballots, the using of COVID-19, I said yesterday, the left in this country are super smart. We underestimate them. The left in this country are opportunists. And so when they had a mass crisis in this country of COVID-19, they used the mail-in ballots to manipulate the election. And so as we head into an election cycle, an election year, and we're months away from the next election in this country, we need to ask ourselves, do we want a secure election? Does the left in this country want a secure election? And if not, we have to ask the whys. Because if they really wanted a secure election, it'd be plain and simple. Everyone would have to show an ID when they vote. Everyone would have to vote in person, unless you're serving our country overseas, unless you request a mail-in ballot. It's plain and simple. We shouldn't be sending out mass mail-in ballots, and we shouldn't have people just showing up on election day with nothing and say, I'm Joe Smith, I'm here to vote. Because that is a system, when we have millions of people in this country, hundreds of millions of people in this country, and we have what we have going on right now at the border with millions of people coming into the country, we can't have a free-for-all. And so it's time that we secure our elections, and the way we do it is by requiring voter ID, requiring a government-issued ID to vote. And it's simple. So again, I'll be back throughout the course of this week. I'll continue these podcasts, and we're going to dive into more issues. If you have an issue you want me to address on future podcasts, all you have to do is send an email to matt@whyimrightpodcast.com. That's matt@whyimrightpodcast.com. gmail.com. Send me an email, communicate back and forth with me. I'll actually respond to you back and forth. Follow us on social media at Why I'm Right, and on Twitter at Why I'm Right Pod. And so again, this has been the Why I'm Right podcast, and I just told you why I'm right.